Well, hello, Folk and Flick. Nice to see you again. I imagine I can see you anyway, and I wish I could. I wish we were face to face at a cafe somewhere in Lisbon. But we're not, so I'm talking to you over the tubes. I was looking at some stuff recently. I'm reading this book very carefully about the legal code, coding capitalism, or the capitalist code. And basically, it's just about the legal situation, law code, and how it's manipulated to benefit big players, corporate players, government players, oligarchs, global corporations, and so on. And it has been like that forever. And if you're going to structure strategically a corporation to maximize its profits, you're going to use a lot of suits. If you've watched that, competitive nature of these corporate lawyers and the huge stakes that they fight for these big corporations and wealthy people. Of course, the law really isn't made for you, not really. But if you're a player, you can manipulate it to create all kinds of new structures and entities and derivatives that can benefit your capital on capital returns. Well, that's interesting. And of course, Chomsky's stuff, I was kind of combining these two books and they complemented each other really well. But other things like Nate Hagen's, but I always talk about Vaclav Smil or Schmiel, or however you pronounce it. The idea that, oil and gas is here to stay, our whole civilization is built on it. So many materials, so many things that we use every single day that we depend on come from petrochemicals, not just fuels for transportation and other things like diesel or propane or whatever, butane. And thinking about Vaclav's thing, concrete, steel, fertilizer, right? Oil and gas. These are the things that modern civilization is built upon. You couldn't have technology or global supply chains without that stuff. You couldn't have big cities. You couldn't have roads going all over the place. I've talked about that when I was riding my bicycle. Think of all the tar, the oil products that are needed just for our roads. The bottom line is we're never going to get away from fossil fuels and from oil and gas, petrochemicals. If we want to have a global civilization, regardless of all our competition between interest groups and nation states and all that kind of thing, we have to cooperate across nation states globally to do anything. That's reality. And the oligarchs know this. The power players know this. You don't. You think you can have a kingdom in, Arkansas or something and everything will be perfect. But it's not going to happen. And if it does happen, it means that a lot of people have starved to death and we've gone back to living like we did, 8,000 years ago. So I keep saying that, and it's true. And circumstances might force that upon us in the future if we don't manage our resources carefully, take care of our environment, address real serious climate change issues. We don't have to be all in climate freaks, scared to death of what's going to happen to tomorrow when the seas rise or something like that. You don't have to be an activist. But you do have to take it into consideration because we need to extract a lot of things to make our world go around, which is why Russia isn't going anywhere anytime soon, because they control a lot of natural resources that the world wants. So even if the United States wants to destroy all the Russians and kill Russia and change the regime over and over again and put hypersonic missiles and missile defense systems right on the border of the Donbass, whatever the heck they want to do, it's not going to change the fact that some people just don't want to be under NATO or the United States hegemon. They don't. And they're going to want to buy stuff from Russia. So they're going to go India and China and South America and Central America, parts of Africa, parts of the world are just going to want to maintain relationships with Russia. And a lot of people have pointed out that it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense for Europe to trade with Russia. And people have pointed out that when this little ridiculous farce of a big mistake that's been hoisted upon us by crazy neoliberal, global financialized, capital fueled ideologues, when this war is over, Germany and Russia will be trading again. Things will regress back to a certain kind of mean because we need this stuff. In the meantime, what does that say about green this and green that and zero emissions and all that? It's not going to happen. We have to figure out a long-term, slow strategy to mitigate the worst effects of climate change and then move forward, doing what we can to maintain peace and our global civilization. I mean, we're probably going to have to consume less and all that kind of stuff, which makes people angry. But the culture wars and all these ideological differences, that's a sideshow if you look at things really seriously, if you analyze the data seriously from an expert's perspective, if you really understand that science isn't a religion, but a way of understanding the world and how it works. It's funny, all the ideologues, they want to talk about, if it's not, well, everybody is ideological, right? Everyone's attracted to one side or another, to this or to that. And of course, people who don't understand the way I see things, they're crazy, and they're ideologues, or they've adopted a new religion called science or something like that. If they look at things my way, then they're rational and they're non-ideological and so on. You see it all the time. So I was watching a Jay Dyer video. Yeah, well, I was watching a couple of videos and reading a couple of articles, and it all kind of falls into this, rules-based order that we have. So in order to do trade and to have treaties and all that, whether it's for nuclear warheads and missiles or whether it's for, energy or the environment or trade or logistics or anything, you've got to have rule of law, right? You got to have some rules, and these rules are different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but you need something, right? So everybody thinks they have the kind of the moral force of, so whatever side you're on, you're going to think, the whole world should kind of model itself after your rule of law, which is basically what happened with, English common law, and how in the United States and Europe that through colonialism and everything, it was adopted, but that doesn't mean that it's uniform around the world. There's big differences for many, many reasons. And that book I mentioned goes into that in detail, and it's quite interesting. But anyway, so, where is this rules-based international order going to go? So I was looking at a video, Scott Ritter, talking about Ukraine with Dmitry Licarius on the Real News Network. And yeah, that's a good outlet as far as I'm concerned. So Scott Ritter has a background in, nuclear proliferation, weapons of mass destruction. He's a military guy. He understands all the nuclear arms, weaponry and all that kind of stuff, the strategic elements of it and whatnot. He's really interesting. And then Jay Dyer, who's the Orthodox guy who loves conspiracy theories and symbolism and so on. He said something interesting in his video where he was talking to Colonel Douglas McGregor, who's a West Point guy, Trumpian. He writes for the New Conservative, and he was talking about how, if you're a pattern seeking person, you're crazy. Well, yeah, we're pattern seeking animals. We all do that. But that doesn't mean that all the patterns you see are represent reality, you know? So yeah, that could be the trees are just blowing in the wind and there isn't a tiger in there. There's nothing wrong with being pattern seeking. That's what we do. But sometimes you go a little bit overboard. So I think Douglas, the Colonel's into this great replacement thing. He's written some articles and op-eds about that and gone on Fox and all that kind of thing. But a lot of the other things that he talks about in terms of geopolitics and military strategy and history and so on is quite enlightened, very, in my opinion, quite on target. So even though I disagree with him adamantly in certain areas, I agree with him in other areas, and that's pretty much how I roll with people. So, or with, yeah, any of these people I pay attention to. I don't have to agree with everything they think. It's vexing. I say, wow, you just jumped from there to there. How did you get there? That's silly. But I'm not going to sit down there and break down everybody's belief systems and tell you where I get off and say, no, I'm not with that.
Like warfare, a siege, a kind of like attempted deconstructing of our country, our civilization. I mean, we see these patterns. We're not supposed to recognize patterns. You're bad if you do that. But is it possible that this is an intentional deconstructing of the U.S., of our economy, of our morale to break us down?
Well, it's hard to resist that conclusion. I mean, if anybody reads your work about Hollywood and looks at the manipulation of symbols,
right,
and their meanings, people are confused now. People have lost a sense of themselves. There's this line from the movie Braveheart, where the man who played Robert the Bruce tries to tell Mel Gibson, who's playing Sir William Wallace, and I like Mel, but he was the wrong guy to play Sir William Wallace, who was 6'7", and a human killing machine. He probably would have been better off with somebody like Dolph Lundgren. But at any rate, he says, you don't understand something, Wallace. This country has no sense of itself from top to bottom. I think that's where we are. And I think it's obviously deliberate. You see it sort of transmitted through film,
right,
through radio, through television, through the internet, breaking down this notion that you as an individual are anything. And it's back to where we started with the Soviet man. It's a sort of more recent version of the same thing. It won't work. I think it's going to be arrested, but it will be because of the economic financial decline combined with what will ultimately be a governmental implosion. It'll be Sri Lanka-like. I've used that sometimes in my op-eds. Oh, come on, Doug. We could never be Sri Lanka. Right. Watch. And what happened in Sri Lanka when everything collapsed? The government got into its limousines and drove away.
Yeah.
People that all want power, and that's what
it's enough for me just to know that I can learn something from them and they're interesting. So I do pay attention to who they talk to, and I listen to really hardcore conservatives sometimes as well, which, progressives drive me nuts as well sometimes. I think we all there's no way you can be an expert in everything. So Jay's read extensively on Orthodox Christianity, and I trust his opinion there, even though, of course, if I'm going to learn about Byzantium or Orthodox Church, I'm going to go to the Orthodox fathers and theologians and other academics and literary critics to get my own opinion on it. But I think I can trust what he seems to know about it as well. So that's okay, even though he's not a presbyter or quote unquote, an academic theologian. He's trained, he went to school for philosophy and things like that, so I can trust his opinion, even though I disagree with him on a lot of culture war stuff and political things. And same thing with Scott Ritter. I think he's pretty much right on, but he's not in the orthodox or what he mainstream opinion.
This is an extraordinarily dangerous situation that we're in right now. There's a lot of talk about nuclear weapons. Why? Russia respects Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which is an attack against one is an attack against all. Russia is fully cognizant of the fact that if it attacks Poland or the Baltic states, it's at war with NATO. And they know what that means. But NATO doesn't respect anything about Russia. NATO knows no limits. NATO has been expanding nonstop. They lied about it, about not wanting to do it back in 1990 to Gorbachev. They've lied about it ever since. They've been expanding. But one of the whole reasons we're at war in Ukraine right now is because of NATO wanting to expand and bring Ukraine into its umbrella. So when Russia moved into Ukraine, it also had to mollify Belarus, which is very nervous, saying, well, okay, while you guys are down here doing that Ukraine thing, what's to protect us? What if NATO decides to come into us? So Russia put a marker down and said, if NATO decides to get involved in this, intervene, we will use all the means at our disposal.
People just don't want to take into account that there's multiple perspectives and that there's more than one side to an issue, right? You just want to discount the other side and say, kill them all. Well, good luck with that. It just doesn't happen, does it? And we do have things we have to worry about, and to effectively address the challenges that we have, we're going to have to cooperate. We're going to have to learn how to cooperate and communicate and collaborate. So you just can't have a clear-cut enmity with China, because the world knows it needs China for various reasons, whether Americans like it or not. And that's just the way the world works, You can have 1 billion bases around the world, and still people are going to want to do their own deals. The idea that there's going to be a federation like Star Trek or something, one world government, that's silly. That's just ridiculous. Not going to happen. Nobody's trying to make that happen. It's just that some people want to cooperate in various ways that maybe you don't like, right? Well, the oligarchs and the corporate bosses and shareholders and hedge funds and bankers are going to cooperate because their world is profits first. That's all they care about. So, of course, they're going to do everything they can to collaborate and cooperate while they're competing for market share and for money and for power. And, of course, as they go along, they're going to try to buy as many assets as they can, not just derivatives and financialized assets, but, real things. And yeah, if they can, they're going to make us rent everything. There won't be any Spanish people in Barcelona. They'll just be Airbnbs. And Spanish people will be in public housing somewhere in the desert, in the hot part of Spain, living their lives while wealthier tourists just go hang out in Barcelona and pretend like it's Spain. That's an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. If they could charge for the air and water that we drink, much more money they would. And keep in mind that this inflation we're all complaining about, the prices never go down to where they were before. That doesn't happen. They might go down a bit after they've gone up, 100 or 1,000%. They might go down 60 or 400%, but they're still going to be higher than they were before inflation started. Now, who engineers this stuff? The players. They're playing the game. They get us into this shit, and then we have to pay for it. Do our salaries go up? No. And we're not going to organize. Labor's not going to get together and work. It's not going to happen. And by the way, if you want to do anything different, other than something with some traditional, weird, conservative thing that never ever happened ever either, like in the Machiavellians, it's almost like Dante, you know, it's a fantasy that you think you've ever had this conservative thing. We haven't had the far left thing or the conservative thing. We've had people who theorize and philosophize about it and fight for it politically just to get power. You have to choose a side. You have to have a market to appeal to when you're trying to get elected and so on. The real players are the business players. They know what they're doing. They know how to manipulate the law to support their profit-making concerns, where you have public-private partnerships that create almost everything that we take for granted, like the drugs and the intellectual property and the technologies that we have. You know, all of these things are developed with public-private funds, but they're, you know, publicly kind of paid for, and then privately the profiteering starts, right? So you know about that, and nothing's gonna stop that, short of like some bizarre like breakout of pandemic of revolutions around the world. And there's only certain places in the world where a revolution might even be plausible or work. Everything will get shut down. So we're going to be in this game for a long time to come. And it's going to have an impact on the environment. And it's going to have an impact on our ecosystems. And it's going to spread and widen inequalities that are exacerbating problems around the world. And this isn't going to stop because there's no incentive built into the system, structured into it. And there's no reason to shift the system when it's working so well for the people who play the game. And it's not you. If you think that because you own some shares and some bonds and some real estate that you're a capitalist, you're fooling yourself. You're a petty rentier. You're just somebody who's playing on the very lower level of it, fantasizing that you're going to break through into some monopoly position in some venture that you create. Or maybe you don't even think like that. You're not a 0 to 1 guy. You don't even know about that. You have a feeling that it's going to happen. And like I said, if we have the NFL, that's the canary in the coal mine. Athletes banging their heads into each other, making millions of dollars with lucrative marketing and advertising deals and PR deals that make them super, super rich. As long as we have professional sports like that, then you know everything's normal, because there's a reason for them to spend billions and billions of dollars on public relations and marketing every year so that these entertainers can get super rich. And a lot of our public figures, our politicians, are just entertainers. That's all they are. Don't think they know more than you do or more than someone else that you think is pretty switched on and smart. They know how to play the game. They know how to kowtow to the right people. And it's performative. You know, they know how to get an audience, make that audience vote for them. And then they go and they serve their masters, which is the people who are doing the business, right? And business requires lots and lots of energy, lots and lots of inputs, and creates lots and lots of externalities. That's just reality, and it's not going to go away. So, you know, there's not much real reason to be out there in the streets marching for climate change or the climate crisis or whatever. Nobody cares about that at the end of the day. They'll start caring when people start starving to death. And that will happen. More migration, more refugee problems. And there will be ideologues on all sides trying to figure out what to do about that. But there's never going to be this moment where people say, I'm a human being first. You know, it's going to be America first, but it's going to be white Christian America first. You know, there's going to be these segments in that population that are meant to be first. And it's never going to be, first of all, I'm a human being. I live on this planet that's, has all these interdependent life forms woven together. It's a complex ecosystem in place, and we've only been around for a very short time. And life forms come and go on this planet, and we're no different. Because we're not going to think like that because we want to believe we're super special, whether we're Americans or Russians or Chinese. And we're going to want to think we're the God's chosen one, even though you can't even conceive of what God might be. And anybody who thinks they can is silly. They're deluded. They're just imaginative children.
We said, oh God, 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 oh God.
What fools the nations are to rage against the Lord.
You know what's fascinating about it is it's just hair, and everybody wants to talk about my hair.
But see, Jan found a scripture in the Old Testament, and in the Living Bible it says that white hair is the crowning glory and is seen most amongst the godly. That is in the scripture.
Now that's something, isn't it?
Yeah.
The apostles were businessmen. They were rich men, had plenty of money. I'm going to show you that Jesus was a wealthy man, had plenty of money. And see, all of that completely foreign to us from a traditional point of view.
You don't know anything about that. We're learning about the universe. If we're around another 30,000 years, who knows what we'll learn. But I don't think we will be. Hubris and arrogance knows no bounds. So we all think we know what we're doing. We don't see those areas in our, minds that lack knowledge and information or the ability to parse certain kinds of information and data. We think, well, I'm pretty damn clever about this and that and the other thing, and I've accomplished this, that, and the other thing. So that must mean that I'm an expert in these other areas as well because, I'm that smart. And, healthy people understand that they have blind spots and that they have cognitive biases and that they're not all that. And they work to understand things through other people that they trust. Yeah, there's this whole thing about the Dunbar number and collaborating in networks like that, and how are we going to do this with blockchain and different kind of computer networks and all that. There's so few people in the world that think in those terms. It's just most people just don't think like that. Donald Trump declared he's going to run for office, which means that he's going to be, everything in the world's going to be about Donald Trump for the next 2 years. Whether you love him or hate him, it's all going to be about him, right? What a terrible force he is in the world, or what a brilliant guy, or all of his fans in the States are going to be just over the moon fighting like hell to get him in. And the people who hate him are going to be fighting like hell to marginalize him and keep him out. And then there are going to be all these little arrogant players like Musk who are going to want to pull the pin on a hand grenade and blow it all up. And some people like Matt Taibbi think that's a good idea because we're losing our freedom of speech and we're becoming a cancel culture type thing and all that stuff. Yeah, so all these changes and all these reactions happen very rapidly nowadays. It might have taken a few years for something to catch on, but since the smartphone and social media, these things are like wildfire, and it's very hard to deal with all of that information and make sense of it. And if we don't do it in smaller groups, as local as possible, and try to keep ourselves together, we're going to have a really hard time. We're going to be batted around by all of these things. And it'll be harder and harder to understand the big picture. Not that we ever did. I always think it's funny when I watch these TV shows or movies and they're reading a newspaper and I'm thinking, Teddy Roosevelt used to think that if he read these newspapers, it was enough for him to know everything he needed to know about the world. Things were simpler back then, you know? It's like nowadays people talk about complexity theory and systems theory and all these other things, and they muddle them all up together. Like quantum mechanics is the same thing as some kind of, you know, spiritual realm or fantasy. And they can't do the math. They don't know the first thing about it, but they use some of the metaphorical language surrounding it and images and memes, and they co-opt them and put them into their space, their domain, and try to make it fit. This happens all the time. It's hard because things are complicated and complex. And it's difficult. So I'm going to talk about these articles a little bit. Hope you don't mind. Okay, I shall continue.